Everyone, we're here for this great new book by Sarah Stein Lubrano, Don't Talk About Politics, which I hope you've all gotten a copy of. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So if not, just if we're getting quiet, just let us know. So this is Sarah's great new book, which I'm really excited we're going to delve into. So I'm Nastaran Tavakoli-Far. So I'm a journalist, I report on current affairs, and for that reason I'm especially excited about this book. Don't talk about politics. Sarah, can you tell us who you are, and then we're going to do a dive in.
I guess I'm a writer now. I have a PhD in political theory from this university. I also worked for many years for the School of Life, and I have a master's degree in intellectual history, which you will probably observe momentarily when we talk about esoteric historical facts. So, yeah.
Okay, great. So Don't Talk About Politics is a great title, because I think a lot of us don't want to talk about politics.
No.
So why shouldn't we talk about politics?
Well, obviously I talk about politics all the time, so in some ways the title is a joke, but really what it is it's a critique of I would say, somewhat cultural and somewhat institutional part of liberalism. And by liberalism, I don't mean a sort of genre on the left end of the political spectrum involving, whoever happens to be in parliament at that time. I mean this as a historical tradition, part of the Enlightenment, and in particular interested in individual rights, in private property, and so on. But one of the arguments I make in the book, and I will read a bit about this probably, is that there is a huge sort of built-in set of cultural assumptions within liberalism, that if you can talk about an idea, if you can engage in discourse, and then there's voting rights, let's say, down the road, then you can basically take care of most political problems, and that's what politics is. And I would say that this isn't just there when we look at how parliaments are created, or even the fact that there are presidential debates, but it's also true when we look at the way that we teach people to write essays, right? The way that we have tons of op-eds, and actually the way I was told to promote this book by my publisher was write a lot of op-eds. And it's very ironic, really, right?
And there's the op-ed in The Guardian, which generated so many comments, which I thought was
700 angry and confused comments. And I guess something that brought me to be interested in this question about does arguing with people change minds, and is it a good form of politics, is that I've studied both psychology and politics. I did a PhD that arguably no one wanted, which was a combination of critical theory, which is one branch of political theory, and cognitive science. And critical theorists are unusual for political theorists because they think that human subjects can often be deeply irrational. There's a lot of Freud built into critical theory, and but a lot of liberal political theories sort of assume that people are vaguely rational actors who can just look at something, figure out their own particular interests in it, and vote in a rational way, in a sort of economic way. And I would say that something that interests me is that cognitive science tends to doubt this also, right? So we have the old school Freudian look at human beings as often irrational actors, especially when it comes to things that involve their own sense of self. And we also have a cognitive science branch of psychology that says the same thing in different ways. And it really strikes me that liberalism still holds on to this sort of mythological subject that can just discuss things and come to the right conclusions based on reason alone, often by themselves in a room alone, perhaps after watching something on television, and then politics is going to be okay because that's possible. So I wanted to critique this idea of discourse as the solution for most political problems, or even a likely solution to almost any political problem. And the first two chapters are organized that way. I look at the myth of the marketplace of ideas and what that does and what it legitimizes often. And I look at debate, which is particularly counterproductive in a lot of ways. It reinforces people's existing political beliefs rather than allow them to think in a new way, let's say.
So we're going to come to that, but before that, can you let everyone know the two things we should be doing instead of talking
Yes, so after I say that we shouldn't debate things, and we shouldn't talk about politics and just assume people will absorb the best view and choose the right outcome, I then look at two things that do statistically have a lot of effect on people's political beliefs and are capable of changing people's minds. And one of those is changes in their network of social relationships. That has a big impact on people's political beliefs, and I look at a lot of evidence for that. And the other thing that appears to change people's political beliefs quite a lot is their own actions. So I think there's a sort of assumption many people hold intuitively that we change our mind and we think, oh, actually something else is better, and then we go out in the world and act. But actually, if you look at a lot of psychology research and sociology research, it's the other way around. We shift our actions, our day-to-day actions or our experiences, and then we shift our political belief. And I have 2 chapters showing all kinds of data about that, and that's why the book has 400 citations, which is very uncommon for a trade book.
So we're going to come to that. So let's go back to the start. So you talked about how talking about politics and debating isn't it doesn't work basically. You start the book with an example I really like. So which is a very quite extreme example. So can you do a little bit of a reading?
Yeah. Should we read a little bit of the introduction? Okay.
Yeah. So I think this gives a good intro to why.
It's an extreme example, but I think useful. The requirement. One day in 2016, shortly after Donald Trump had been chosen as the Republican nominee in the US presidential election, I went out for ice cream with some friends. As we sat with our cones, one friend asked, "Do you guys remember when Donald Trump's campaign manager was fired for punching a woman in the face?" We did not. But perhaps the remarkable thing was that so many wild things had happened in that election period alone that this particular tale was already buried in a distant media cycle, overshadowed by revelations about porn stars and Trump's boasts of pussy grabbing. Unless you are reading this in the far distant future, you know political life became mostly ever weirder after that year. Less apparently rational, more self-destructive, more dishonest, more violent, and more chaotic in the US and in other countries too. Not only that, but talking about politics became stranger too, on and offline. People who appeared to be relatively left or right suddenly switched sides or fell down conspiracy rabbit holes. There was more yelling, more trolling, more fake things appearing real, and more real things appearing fake. Today, all this is part of a common worry on both right and left. The public sphere seems broken. People worry about cancel culture, wokeness, free speech, polarization, echo chambers, and conspiracy thinking. They are concerned about people's inability to speak to one another about politics. Watching this fracturing of public discourse and political life has been one of the most jarring changes of my adult life, and I receive notifications about it all day long on my phone. So I have spent a great deal of time trying to understand it. I try to understand why people on Twitter/X spend so much time bickering, why conspiracy theories always seem to bloom around the latest news story, why family members talk past each other at the dinner table, or why politicians can win round voters by fueling barely comprehensible grudges. And when I think about this, why the public sphere is so divided, confusing, and stymied, I have come to wonder at the assumption that discourse could work easily in the first place. I particularly wonder that it ever seemed that a good idea or a powerful argument could be enough to change your mind, even if you only hear it once. And then I think about the Spanish requirement of 1513. The requirimiento, as it was called, was a declaration that Spanish settlers were supposed to proclaim when they encountered new groups of indigenous people. It explained that the land they had been living on for thousands of years was actually Spanish, because the Pope had, quote, made donation of these isles to the king and queen, as is contained in certain writings which passed upon the subject as aforesaid, which you can see if you wish. Citations available upon request. Indigenous people were asked that you consider what we have said to you, that you take the time that shall be necessary to understand and deliberate upon it, and then to acknowledge the church, pope, and king and queen as their sovereigns. If they accepted their new overlords, the Spanish colonizers claimed untruthfully, they would be treated well. If not, we shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command, and we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, and we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault. This was an ultimatum, phrased as information in order to absolve those speaking of further obligation. The whole process was haphazard. Typically, a small group of indigenous people would be gathered on the beach where the Spanish boats landed and read the text on behalf of all the inhabitants on the island, even if, as regularly happened, it was read to them without translation. And if they did not immediately understand and accept, then violence, slavery, and general plunder followed and were considered to be justified. According to the requirimiento, any deaths or losses were, in fact, entirely the natives' own fault. It was the whitewashing of its time, an attempt to make something unjust look less so by vaguely nodding to consent and discourse and ethical values. it was in large part constructed as a response to those in Spain who, even then, dissented from the murderous acts perpetuated by the colonizers. But of course, it was hardly an improvement on or justification for the genocide about to take place. Yes, it's an extreme historical example, but the idea that we are at fault if we're not immediately converted by the truth is not so unusual. While there is a lot of theological debate on the matter, to this day, many Christians believe that those who have never heard the gospel get some special consideration in the next life. But for the rest of us, it is believed, who have heard the gospel, even briefly, even badly translated, even just once, we have our mortal souls on the line, our eternal fate dependent on our response. You shouldn't need to tell people twice. That's the idea. I've always found this notion that someone talking to you could sway your understanding of the structure of the universe, compared with the weight of all your own experiences, your family and relationships, your personal convictions, and your previous commitments, terribly ambitious. Perhaps it's that I'm Jewish and we don't proselytize. And yet, this is the premise of our modern political culture. We are given access to media and debates, and then we have the chance to vote. We're told that a little critical thinking should be enough to furnish a democracy, and encouraged to focus on that, even by psychologists and commentators who probably know that that's not how people really behave, especially when it comes to politics. Meanwhile, trust in society and interest in politics have hit a nadir in many countries around the globe. Perhaps that's because discourse, which is so highly valued in theory in our society, appears so ineffective in practice. Or perhaps it's because politics simply feels too sinister and hopeless to too many of us, unfixable. We might sense that the politicians that consult us for our views have already got their own plans firmly in place, that our neighbor is being fed disinformation by bots at a speed we could never counter, that something about our newsfeed is targeting us like a sniper. Trying to engage with these odds stacked against us can feel fruitless. Talking more with those near us often is not only deeply frustrating, but also diverts our energies from other solutions to the world's most pressing problems. It can be much easier to disengage. And while we do, those in power do as they like.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful opening. And a little later you say, debate culture has led to harmful and unproductive forms of politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we're in this era where, you know, we hear this phrase marketplace of ideas, and I mean, I don't know about all of you, but I'm someone who is always following new ideas and things. What is the problem with this phrase and this kind of thinking that, you know, we just need to like debate ideas against each other and they will actually lead to sort of change?
I mean, the main reason that it's bad is because it is empirically untrue. I think there are other good reasons, but I think we should start there. When you look at all of the available data and evidence about if we give people new ideas, do they change their mind? The answer is more or less flatly no. Yeah. And I think this is a critique to some degree of both right and left ends of the political spectrum. So if you look in the book, I first look at whether, you know, televised debates change voters' views. Not at all. We have lots of evidence, nothing happens. But also protests, demonstrations specifically, that is, have no long-term effect on political outcomes. Even the Black Lives Matter protests, which seemed to change public opinion for a few years, were back at the same baseline as before. So it seems that being exposed to ideas has really no effect in the long term on people's views. And that alone should be enough in a way to dismantle this idea that the marketplace of ideas will solve certain political ills, or it is like the place where sunlight, you know, cures all. But there are other problems, as I sort of made clear in this example, however extreme. It also means that those who are already in power can say, I'm in power because my idea won, because of course the best ideas always win, so mine must be the best idea, right? And that legitimizes those in power.
Yeah.
And then for those who can't accept that as an outcome, they're completely disinvested, arguably, or they often become completely disinvested. So, you know, the people that were writing New Left Review in the 60s said, like, this just shows that there's no way we can get power, and they gave up for a while.
Yeah.
And of course it's a very capitalist metaphor. It assumes markets and democracy are compatible, and I could go on and on and on. But yeah, there's a whole rundown of reasons why I think it's an extremely deceptive idea that politics could work that way, or should. Because as a last point, one of the things I think about a lot, and I put in the book here, is that I don't really think ideas are commodities that we can hold in our hands and be like, I have this idea. I say, you know, it's not that we have ideas, it's that ideas have us. And the really big ideas in my life are things that have a grip on me, you know. They're my concepts of justice, or, you know, my commitments to certain visions of the world. They have me and not the other way around.
So now we're going to move on to some of the more hopeful
aspects,
which is that it's our actions and relationships that do lead to change. So you've got this you've got this quote I really like, ideas do matter, they matter through our actions and relationships, and that this is a hopeful thing.
Yeah.
Now I'm seeing, this is a bit anecdotal, but the people around me, I think everyone's very hungry to, you know, do something on the ground. There's this frustration with, you know, we just vote every few years and, you know, we feel so helpless. And that, you know, there is like a lot of data, for example, with like climate change and people increasingly saying, yes, this is an important issue, but you know, I want to do something and stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about actions and relationships? And you know, there's an example you have that
Ever since I published this book, everyone just wants to talk to me about this one food co-op that I write about. Like, and actually,
we're all going to join a food co-op.
Well, I actually joined this food co-op. So yeah, I'll read you the excerpt in a minute. But I think people feel incredibly, you know, powerless, and that's a very dangerous place for anyone to be. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading cognitive psychology, and it kind of kept me hopeful and keeps me hopeful now, is that so much of the cognitive psychology findings are about people behaving sometimes in interesting ways, sometimes in bad ways, sometimes in good ways, but generally in an attempt to secure for themselves either the illusion or the reality of agency. You know, the image generated in the cognitive science that I was studying is a person or a subject that wants agency, wants it so much that they're willing to delude themselves, that they are willing to do all kinds of things to get agency. And actually that makes me hopeful, even though it also can explain, you know, the motivations of my political enemies or people who believe conspiracy theories. I'd much rather believe in a meaning-seeking subject than someone that just wants their, you know, economic material benefit. And I think that's why people love this example, because it's very concrete and it kind of suggests a mode of agency that is possible, that almost anybody can do. It's also not isolated or alone, it's a collective form of agency. So I'll read the example because people really like it, and then we can talk more about that.
So I think this is a really good example of how, I'd say, like how actions we don't think are political can become very, very political and powerful.
Yeah, and then I did join this, by the way. I'm actually distributing the groceries tomorrow, so. Okay. Effective organizing involves providing experiences and actions for people and then giving them space and tools to make sense of what they are doing. Food cooperatives, for example, can do this. I was lucky enough to visit one in Gospel Oak, London, when writing this book. It is part of a larger network called Cooperation Town, and it is not the sort that some readers may already be familiar with, where upper middle class people club together to buy especially fresh or organic groceries. Rather, the co-ops in this network are for anyone, usually working class people, to have the opportunity to collectively purchase less expensive food. The one I visited was housed in a community center where small children played with the delivery trolleys as their parents collected the weekly groceries. I spoke to Shiri Shalmi, who works for Cooperation Town and is a co-op member herself. She's found that members of the co-op come to think about their neighbors and the economy differently. Food co-ops are, in a way, very simple. Once people join, they take turns purchasing the food in bulk for the group that week, bargaining with the local stores, and distributing to their neighbors. The results, especially when donations of food are included, mean that many people can get their groceries for as little as £3 a week per person. In the process of buying and distributing, members gain new knowledge and organizing skills. For not only does organizing a food co-op look a lot like, well, organizing people for political action, but along the way, many members witness firsthand how broken the food system is. As they bargain with local stores for batch prices, buyers learn how much food is wasted because the supermarkets are overstocked with excess produce, which is generally thrown out, all to ensure complete and constant availability of every fruit or vegetable. They also know not just one another's fridge contents, but also their families' hopes and worries. And they look out for each other. I learned that when an older woman in the food co-op fell, hurt herself, and couldn't get up, her family didn't know what to do, and it was the other members of the food co-op who noticed the woman's husband was coming by himself and asked, gently but persistently, until they discovered the issue and sprang into action to get her medical care. People look after one another in practical ways, which builds commitments to everyone's well-being. And this, Shiri notes, means that when they come to demolish the housing estate, we're already organized. Indeed, when members have faced eviction, their fellow co-op members have shown up to guard the home and prevent it. Shalmi notes that in a lot of traditional models, getting people to care about political issues happens at a point of conflict, when the landlord raises the rent, when the employer cuts hours, and so on. It is only then that people who may otherwise have been disengaged, overwhelmed, or unmotivated join struggles and dive into political action. Cooperation Town and projects like it are powerful because they rely not on a point of conflict, but on fulfilling basic human needs. It's an easy point of entry for getting people into organizing, says Shiri. For it to be relevant, you just need to eat and have neighbors. None of this requires arguments in either sense of the word. Instead, people begin to think about how they should have cheaper food, or about how supermarkets shouldn't be allowed to mandate overproduction, or why evictions are wrong, as they encounter these issues in the world. Indeed, none of this involves much abstract discussion, and yet, along the way, members of food co-ops tend to change their views on how the economy functions and what they'd like to do about it.
Yeah, and you've joined a few.
Yeah, I've joined, yeah. I haven't
No,
stopped an eviction yet, though, so I'm just a newbie.
I started scoping some out in my area.
Oh, great, yeah.
But something else I like about this example is that we also see relationships come into play.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that? And I'm also thinking, because, you know, we're increasingly in this sort of age of people's relationships falling apart because of politics, or, you know, not wanting to speak to people who sometimes it might even be a legitimate reason for, you know, people who have very different beliefs, but, you know, that is actually how we can influence, our relationships are how we can really influence each other. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, so my next book is about just really what chapter 6 is about, social atrophy. And what I mean by this, I mean this at several levels.
Social atrophy.
Social atrophy. So social atrophy is firstly a term that's used to describe actually the changes that happen in the brain when human beings are isolated. And those changes are remarkable. The gray matter in the front of your brain that is responsible for judging social interaction shrinks over time pretty quickly, actually. Whether people are old or young, they become much more less adept at judging social interactions. They tend to interpret neutral cues as negative, so they say, oh, this person hasn't texted me back. They must hate me. They sense aggression where there isn't aggression. They become basically paranoid in the lower case sense of the word. And all kinds of other bad things happen as a result. And I'm very interested in that neuroscience, but what I'm also interested in is the 50 to 70 year long-standing trend in the UK and the US of people increasingly spending more and more time alone. And the way that governments like to talk about this is that we have a loneliness epidemic, but it's a terrible term because actually statistically people don't say they're any lonelier. They're just more alone. And that makes sense if you think about the neuroscience, because basically somebody who's isolated long enough might not even have enough attunement to their social world to notice that perhaps they should be somewhere with other human beings, right? You can lose the capacity to feel lonely, but our brains need this social interaction. It's our biggest workout. It's extremely cognitively complex to talk to other human beings. It's like our full body workout every day, and when we're increasingly, you know, without that, there's a sort of neuroscience set of effects, but there's also a political sense of effects. We could tell this story without the neuroscience, although I always like to bring it in and make both political theorists and neuroscientists unhappy, which is that people are increasingly isolated, right? And interestingly, this is profoundly correlated with a lack of social trust and social cohesion, which are major marks in political science for all kinds of other ills, including, you know, belief in disinformation, belief in conspiracy theories, all the things liberals worry about, but also just right-wing beliefs in general. Somebody sent me amazing data yesterday, which is going in the next book, about how more than a lot of other signifiers, more than class, more than education, one of the main predictions of voting for Trump is just if you live far away from other human beings physically. Or, you know, there's an aspect of this that relates to what Marxists might call alienation, where you're estranged from some aspect of yourself, you know, if you're a humanist Marxist. And I would say there's a kind of sociological alienation. So to go back to the relationships, I spent an entire chapter talking about friendship, but specifically talking about the kinds of social relationships that orient us in the world politically, right? And the way that actually human beings don't seem to take in ideas in the abstract. We take them in from other people. We build trust, and then we can entertain an idea. And from the research we have, it's not that people come along and they brainwash us. And we can disagree with our friends, and that seems to be relatively durable. We're not just going to immediately migrate to our friends' views, but they seem to help people clarify their views, and they also have a remarkable impact on prejudicial beliefs in general. So one of the bits of sociology that I'm especially interested is something called social contact theory, or the social contact hypothesis, which is a bunch of research that's done on what reduces prejudice in institutional or group settings. And there are very specific things that need to happen for people to become less prejudiced. The organization that's organizing the thing needs to be explicit about equality within that group. It also needs to be set up in practice so that there's equality. So if you imagine an institution where the workers that are like a lower rung are mostly people of color, and then the upper rung workers are white people, that won't work, right? You need both real and explicit equality in a variety of ways. But you also need people to have shared goals and to have long enough periods of time together that they can establish basically friendships, like long-form, meaningful relationships. And that seems to reduce prejudice in all kinds of areas dramatically. It reduces racial prejudice, it reduces homophobia, it reduces, kind of anything. In fact, there's even a study that it reduces prejudice against bots. Like if you hang out with your bot long enough in a setting that makes you feel like equals, you will become less prejudiced against AI, which I think is bad because I am prejudiced against AI. But I'm very interested in this question of what relationships do to our politics and very concerned about this trend of social isolation. And yeah.
So you have a line I like, which is when we radically change our political views, it's often due to our friends and relationships.
Yeah. I think a lot of liberal frameworks that I grew up with, and even a lot of the organizing work I've lived through, and all this stuff about messaging and storytelling, people are like, I just want to have the right one single conversation and then I'll persuade somebody. But it's not the conversation, it's the relationship. That's the phrase I use over and over again. You have to build a relationship. Why would anyone care about what you have to say until you have a relationship, right?
Yeah. Sarah, what about the, we've been talking about echo chambers a lot.
Yeah, people love this phrase. Yeah.
Past few years. So how does that come in? Because I wonder, maybe some people hearing this are thinking, oh, well, are you just going to surround yourself with people who already think about you? Like, how already think like you?
There is self-sorting, right? And that's like potentially dangerous. I mean, personally, I'm actually not that concerned about what you might call like the most basic form of polarization. I think it's fine that people disagree with each other about things. I am concerned about particularly like hateful views, and I'm very far on one end of the political spectrum, but that I'm not a liberal, so I don't in a way necessarily think it's all about just like being nice to each other and if we talk enough we'll get to the same position. Not at all. But yeah, I think it is important to have institutions that provide these conditions for basic prejudice reduction, which is a very different thing, right? Prevent essentially dehumanization of particular groups. And I guess that's where a lot of my interest in this lies. And also because then we can care about what those groups necessarily care about, right? So if you become less prejudiced against women or trans people or whatever, then you also begin to care about the issues that affect them. And for me, that is a real relational form of political education. Not that we'll come to agree on everything, because that's a different matter, right?
So I wanted to bring up two big themes and ideas that come up. So we've been in this sort of like digital era, where we've kind of had the last 15 years or so of like debating online, and then there was all this excitement around the Arab Spring and Twitter, and like this is gonna change politics and stuff, and that hasn't happened. So digital life has not been great for us in terms of
certainly not for me. I'm not enjoying it. No.
And also you talk about third spaces, which is very related. So why has digital life failed us when it comes to us organizing and mobilizing? And I mean, there's that phrase in real life, but that is what third spaces are about, which is a very powerful example you talk about.
So I think these are two related questions. One is about why is online life so bad? And I guess one of the things I always point to is that the conditions I just laid out for the reduction of prejudice and the forming of long-term relationships basically don't exist online. Everything I've just described, maybe your online space gestures at equality of participants, but actually, most online spaces I see are very hierarchical in certain ways. Certain people just have way more followers or whatever, right? And then there's no shared goal at all. What on earth is your shared goal on Twitter, I don't know. And actually, interestingly, another condition of social contact theory is that the things people are prejudiced about have to remain salient. So for example, if you're going to become less racist, the person's racialization has to be part of how you experience them. And actually, a lot of our characteristics are hidden online, right? So there's all kinds of problems with online in terms of the sociology and psychology of belief change, and that's one aspect.
But sorry, I have a quick question. Why is it that I talked of Arab Spring, but there, why did these sort of early examples of mobilization happening on the internet? Why have they not sort of continued? And
well, because they're basically one of the things I talk about in this book is about networked protest in the age of networked protest, which is usually referring to really big protests that sprung up very rapidly, like Occupy, Tahrir Square in Egypt. And one of the things that sociologists of protest noted is that a lot of the ties that brought people there were weak ties. Not all of them. I have interesting chats with my Egyptian sociology friends about, actually people knew each other on the street. But overall, what online relationships tend to do is mobilize what sociologists call weak ties. So your weak tie is like not your closest friend. It's like a friend of a friend. Your friends are my weak ties, right? We are actually friends, but and that is powerful in one sense because you can get a lot of people on the street really rapidly. But on the other hand, those ties can't ask that much of you, you know. And so if one of your friends asks me to do them a favor, I do them a favor. But if they ask me to do them 6 favors, I'd probably tell them to, you know, stick it.
You just won't talk to them.
Yeah, and but if you asked me to do, you know, if you asked me to do you 6 favors, I would. And I think one of the things that network protests failed at because of the technology and the affordances that they were given at the time is that they mobilize people with weak ties, and that dissipates protest movements very rapidly, right? So one of the things I talk about is that although this is difficult, I actually think we need to go back to an organizing model that is about stronger ties and actually more investment up front. And I think people are really worried about this. The activists I teach and talk to say, you know, like, it's asking so much of people. But if you look at a bunch of very historic and successful protest movements, let's say the civil rights movement, people are deeply involved, and they have to be because the technological affordances for other forms of organizing are not possible then, right? And if you look at how, for example, the civil rights movement was organized, it was organized in the barbershop that you went to every day. You could not possibly get away from these people. That's actually really powerful, right? And then you have to do all of these really boring things. Like there's whole conversations about sandwiches for the Million Man March, and we can't have mayonnaise because the sandwiches will rot. So, you know, and that's really boring, but it turns out from a psychological perspective, it's extremely powerful because you've now spent 300 hours with these people in person. And when they call you up and tell you you better go do something, you're going to do it, you know?
Yeah. And so something you talk about a lot is third spaces.
Yeah.
So I wanted you to tell us about this. And also, I think I found this so compelling because, again, so many of us are hungry to do things in real life, meet people in real life, be involved in stuff kind of like in person and in space.
But also afraid of it. If you look at some of the data, people are also anxious about it.
Yeah. But a lot of us are unable to do that because we lack these third spaces.
Because we're missing the infrastructure. So when you look at, first of all, to define a third place, I think is the word. So the third place in sociology, again, my new favorite discipline, is a place that's neither work nor the home. And that's a very beneficial thing because it means it doesn't have the privateness of the home, right? So you can't really be excluded from it unless you've done something really nuts. Like you can go into any pub unless you've really misbehaved, right? And it doesn't have the hierarchy of the workplace, and arguably the hierarchy of the home, by the way. But so you're conceptually equals within that space. And various sociologists have thought about the usefulness of these places for public life and civic life and democracy, and you know, this is kind of Habermas's point. Habermas is the featured philosopher, so to speak, in this book in some ways, as a place that generates democracy. But we are facing an absolute decline of these places for the last 50 to 70 years. And you can measure this in different ways. There's a decline of green spaces that are public, there's a decline of pubs, they're all going out of business. The music industry that's live music has reduced in half. This all sounds kind of like bourgeois lifestyle choices, but it has a very long-term effect on people's ability to engage in civic life at all or meet people different from themselves at all, right? And now I find even if you go to a cafe, and cafes used to be in some ways radical places, you know, when Habermas is writing about this, the government was worried about these spaces because they said if people go to the coffee shops and they drink coffee, they're going to cut off the king's head, and they were right, you know. But now you go to the coffee shop and like everyone's on their phones. Yeah. So, so there's, for me, I think it's pointless to opine morally on a lot of this stuff, right? And that's why you need the infrastructure. And the third places are the infrastructure for in-person social connections, which are stronger and allow there to be enough social fabric that you can mobilize politically, and people can become aware of the politicalness of their lives again.
Do you have more examples? Because the examples you gave are also businesses, so other examples of things.
My favorite one that I think about a lot is about the parents of children and how you pick up your kids from school. Mm-hmm. So where I grew up, there were two bits of the school where you could pick up your child. One of them was this like line of cars, right? And the other one is the playground. And one of those is a social infrastructure. It supports people socializing, right? For either no cost at all, and it encourages them. It does the thing that the best infrastructures do, where it like gently leads them towards the ideal outcome of talking to other parents while you watch your children, I don't know, eat bugs off the floor or whatever. And the other one, you sit alone in your car and you meet nobody, and you wait for your child while you stare at your phone. And so I'm very interested in this question of in particular, I think we have a problem right now where people like me, upper middle class, like bourgeois, annoying, educated people think, I'm gonna make a third place, and then they go make like, you know, a bookstore that sells really expensive lattes that's also a sex club, and, you know, whatever, I don't know. And that's not actually a lot of the social infrastructure that's needed. What's needed is, you know, walkable, free places to be with your kid, where you can bring an elderly person or a disabled person. And that's what we see, especially a huge decline in, like basically a hostile architecture. And we also see living becoming nearly impossible for people, so they move out.
Yeah.
Your and my generation, roughly, millennials, let's say, are the first generation that have moved less than their parents and their grandparents. They just stay put. And when they do move, they move away from city centers. And that's simply because there are not jobs to move to. Yeah. And it is not affordable to stay where they are when they are in a central place. And so they are more and more isolated and less likely to be in a social political infrastructure.
There were a few things I wanted to ask. I was wondering whether other readings you wanted, so I can ask around them.
I don't know, we could do a bit of the last bit at the end maybe, or about activists, that could be nice.
Cool. Shall I ask you my other
Yeah,
questions?
please, yeah.
So, no, actually, if you do that and then I'll end.
Okay, good. I'm going to read one more bit and then we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll ask questions, we'll get questions. Okay, this is at the very end of this book. In an earlier chapter, I described how those who join activist groups are profoundly changed as a result. One of the more striking changes is that those who are engaged in activism are happier. They see their lives as more meaningful than do people who otherwise hold similar views but do not engage in activism. This is remarkable given how happiness data looks on the whole when it comes to politics. On average, left-wing people are less happy than right-wing people in nearly every country on earth where this is measured, and this seems true even when one holds for other variables that affect happiness, such as income level, marriage, religiosity, and so on. One might even argue, however, that this makes sense, because, after all, left-wing people are more likely to be unhappy with the status quo. If one looks at all the data on left-wing people, one finds lots of possible reasons why they might be more unhappy. They see more rifts in their friendship, they are more likely to self-criticize and worry, they follow the news more closely, which lately makes everyone I know tremendously unhappy. And yet, while left-wing people are more unhappy than right-wing people, activists are happier than non-activists. Activists seem to be able to beat these depressing statistics. Sometimes, when I present this finding during talks, people in the audience protest. Happier, they say. What about activist burnout? What about the internal splits always happening in left-wing groups? What about the difficulty of seeing everything through the lens of oppression? But statistically, activists are happier than non-activists who share their beliefs. Sure, there's measurable burnout in a not insignificant minority of this group, but this still seems to be true. There's even some evidence that this is causal, that it's the activism itself that is making them happier. And this does not surprise me, because activism involves so many of the things that otherwise seem to give people meaning and joy in life. Personal agency, the ability to take action on the things they care about, community, a sense of meaning. This matters a lot. There is also a lot of psychological evidence that people who feel they have some agency or autonomy in their lives are better off. So it's likely that it's a lack of agency that matters most, that makes so many left-wing people sad, and not just their views themselves. Thinking the world is on fire makes you a lot less psychologically well, but thinking that the world is on fire and that you can do something about it with other people makes things bearable, even inspiring and meaningful again. It allows you to be less interested in or caught up in armchair debates, to transcend some theoretical differences by taking action instead. And it returns you to a community, however difficult that community may sometimes be. This brings us to a larger point. One of the most cherished parts of liberalism, I suspect, is a resistance to the idea that being political can make one happy, or more specifically, it is a desire for a boundary on the political, between the political and the rest of our life. The term the public sphere implies, of course, that there is a private sphere, and liberal political theorists have emphasized this, pointed joyfully to the idea that in liberal societies, the government and church are limited. You can, in theory, go home, close your door, and enter a private world, one untouched by the state or the stress of political life. Various recent commentators, even indeed esteemed political scientists, have suggested that perhaps part of the reason we are so polarized is that everything has become political, and that if we could just make things less so, things could go back to the way they supposedly once were, more civil and rational and less contentious. But this is a profound misrecognition of the reality we face, for two reasons. First, often these thinkers are really describing the detrimental effects of a certain kind of culturally idealized discourse, debate and the marketplace of ideas. They are describing not just the effects of being political, but rather the effects of just talking about politics, the outcome when people who lack much in the way of social relationships and diverse experiences collide. What polarizes us is not politics itself, nor even political discussions, but the way we've ended up doing these in a socially atrophied, infrastructurally poor world. And second, it is an alluring idea that we can exit the political, but it's a fantasy. Politics is not escapable, not even through denial, and it never really was, except as an illusion for smaller privileged groups. Climate change and migration and war are at our doorstep and will dominate the next few decades. The economic system that has made nearly everyone poorer and more precarious is an unavoidable political problem. Being less political isn't really possible, and it turns out that, for those of us who are progressive or left-wing, trying to be less political will only make us unhappier anyway. The wise or mature position, then, is not to be less political, but to be more political. Our day-to-day lives could involve a deep care for and organizing around political issues, in particular the building and rebuilding of relationships and places of belonging, the rebuilding of infrastructure, and the creation of action possibilities for people to try out new and varied ways of living. This is the business of politics, in truth, and all the discourse in the world and all the talking about politics sits largely downstream of that. And the good news is that this building of relationships, networks, and action possibilities is both effective and something that is likely to make us happier. Because of this, I still feel hopeful about human beings and sometimes even about politics. Hopeful, even after abandoning the myth that simply exposing people to the right ideas will set politics on the right course. Hopeful, even after abandoning the also common implicit myth that progress is inescapable and inevitable, or likely to come from anything other than hard work. For if I had to gesture broadly and summarize what I have learned as I look at this giant body of mixed and complicated sociological and psychological evidence, it is that humans want to make meaning out of their lives. They are motivated to think and believe in ways that allow them to think of themselves as good people. They want to believe they could have agency and use it for good in the world around them. Of course, this analysis includes everyone, those I disagree with, those on the right, those trending towards fascism, the actual fascists, those defending the indefensible. Nevertheless, this meaning-based understanding of human beings gives us reason to believe that we could politically reconfigure our world for the better. We do not have to live under a profit-maximizing system. We do not have to compete ferociously with everyone around us. We do not even have to spend all our time arguing with each other. We could choose another way and be happier for it. There are at least two ways to love ideas, to talk about them and to live them in the world. My fellow lovers of ideas, the beauty of re-understanding politics in the way I suggest here is that it is still possible to believe in ideas. Ideas do matter, but they matter through our actions and our relationships. And that is a hopeful thing. Let us try to go out and live out our ideas in relationship with other people. And let's try to build a world where it's easier for everyone to do this, because that's what it means to truly think about politics. If we do it well, thinking about, talking about, and ultimately doing politics might become less painful, exhausting, and scary. It could even become, on a particularly good day, meaningful, beautiful, and fun.
I feel really energized. Yeah.
This is the pep talk that we get before we, do the revolution, yeah.
So I've got one thing I'm going to leave right to the end.
Okay.
But now on that very hopeful note, wondering any questions or,
Yeah.
If information isn't good for changing people's minds or fostering discourse, what do you see as the role for media in politics, or is there a role for media?
This is a great question, especially since Nasta's a journalist.
I'm a journalist.
Oh, you're a
I'm
journalist,
very
yeah,
interested.
great. I mean, I think, I actually don't, I can't give you like a single immediate answer, because I think this is like a big question and it needs, many possible solutions. I still believe in information and reporting. I mean, there's, I want to know what's going on in the world. I think there are other reasons to engage in discourse. It's just not for political change in itself, right? And actually, at one point in the book, on a separate note, I quote this wonderful German physicist who wrote this grumpy letter in the 1700s, and he says, I'm still going to make arguments, even though I know they change no one's mind, and I've given up on that because I want to tell my enemies that they have not persuaded me, and I am still here. Right? Yeah, and I'm like, I get it, right? So I'm not saying we don't need a media sphere. We definitely need a media sphere not owned by billionaires, which we don't have. But I would actually, I would say that I don't see that as the realm in which politics happens. Right? In the same way that I don't think literature is mostly the realm in which politics happens. If one wanted to make a form of media that was more political, I would look for two things related to each of the two things that I talk about in the book. One is relationships. It's noticeable to me that we now consume most media alone. Alone, right? So you might have thought, okay, first you're in the coffee shop and you read the newspaper together. Fascinating, now you have a social relationship. Okay, and then you're in the home and it's private space, it's not a third place, but you're watching it with your spouse, so I guess at least you're doing politics with your spouse or whatever, right? And now we watch it alone on our phones. Like when I consume media, my spouse isn't even there. Never mind, diverse groups of people with different political interests than myself. And so one thing I'm very interested in is, can we create forms of media consumption that are social, or maybe require sociality in some level? And I think the other question is about providing people with ideas for action possibilities in their lives. It's very interesting to me that the thing I get asked about over and over again is food co-ops. I mean, I like food co-ops, they're great, but like the reason people like that is not because it's the most important thing I've said, it's because it's the one thing they think they could actually do. And I think there's a role for the media in providing that also, potentially, if that's helpful. Yeah.
This reminds me, recently I've been listening to records and missing that whole thing of getting together and listening to stuff together, because it just feels like so solitary, and then you have to just have a conversation about it, which feels very different.
Yeah.
But if I'm allowed to give an opinion as a journalist,
okay,
I feel like the media, so this is just my opinion, but I think we haven't been active enough in holding powers accountable, so I do see our role as again kind of doing rather than just talking about things, and that's more what we should be doing, putting pressure on the powerful to change things. But any other questions? So I wanted to ask another thing before we come to the end. Where does economics play a role in all this era of increasing inequality, which I think goes into so many areas of our lives? You talk about how we need greater economic equality for greater democracy, so I'm wondering where this comes in.
Look, I'm a Marxist at the end of the day, in the way and I would say this in a methodological sense, the way I look at sociology is as a Marxist person. Not that everything Marx wrote was great, since he contradicts himself all the time, but there are certain analytic frameworks that I care about. And I think the interesting and important piece of news is that throughout everything I've just said, there is a profound economic element. I'm particularly interested in the way that social trust is an almost exact correlate with inequality. And you can even see the mechanisms at play. So, for example, they ran a really interesting study where they looked at Americans and when they lose their jobs. And if they happen to be signed up for Obamacare in time and they don't lose their health insurance, they tend to trust society about the same during that period of unemployment. And if they in fact now don't have healthcare, their social trust drops. Social trust is this kind of benchmark thing that we need to care about, which reflects roughly whether you think on average, can you trust a stranger in your community? Would they be there for you in a crisis? Blah, blah, blah. But it really matters because once people lack social trust, all kinds of other things start going wrong politically at a number of levels. So that's the psychological interaction with inequality. But of course, the other thing is just this material basis for doing anything or seeing anyone or having these social relationships, right? Most of the reasons that people are socially atrophied, there are other variables in play. There's sort of the falling apart of religious commitments for people. Technology obviously has a massive effect because we can be on our phones, but actually when you look at the reasons people are spending time alone, none of that on its own is a good enough explanation. No single technological shift suddenly made people far more isolated. And one of the main reasons people are isolated is because it's expensive to leave their house and go anywhere. And the places they can go are further and fewer between. So I would say that the reason that our relationships are weaker and the reason that we see fewer and fewer action possibilities for ourselves are largely material in a number of different ways, right? And similarly, the reason people don't see action possibilities for themselves is because they can't afford them, or they, like the millennials I was talking about, they can't switch jobs. There are no better jobs for them. But as our lives get constrained, our thinking gets constrained too, and then we become unable to imagine a different reality, which is a huge problem.
Do we have any?
I'd love other questions if there are some. Yeah, the pink sweater human.
So, not sure if it's a question or an observation.
Sure.
I think one of the reasons that politics seems so stressful now is that what is political is becoming, things that weren't political are now politicized in a really uncomfortable, negative way with the culture wars. So politicians are now expected, or are being brought into discussions of what a woman is, and the anti-abortion debate is being opened up again, etc. Things that maybe in the past have been discussed and we've sort of moved on, and that actually they're very emotive and they're being weaponized. And I feel that the area that politicians should be focusing on, you say economics, improving, people's standard of living, the justice system, etc., they're moving their focus onto things that really are not their forte, shall we say, and actually that is creating a lot of negativity and a lot of confusion and negative discourse.
Yeah, I would relate this to the last reading I did, right? But I do want to sort of just point out that I think it's not. Look, I agree that especially the right is very good at finding a wedge issue, something that makes people feel a bit icky and weird and uncomfortable, and saying like, let's politicize this. Our opponents look bad when they talk about this, and then they, create a whole thing about it. Not that the left can't do this too, but the trans issue, for example, is a perfect wedge issue for the right. But I would also say, I think, it's also about the format of discourse. People disagree all the time in communities where they hang out and have deep investments in each other's mutual lives, and they survive that conflict differently, right? And I think that a lot of the reason that we find this stuff so uncomfortable and painful is because we're doing it online, and we're doing it in a way that lacks any relationality and that lacks basic material comfort for people, or basic material safety. And I think that makes that a lot more painful. So I would see that as not that we need to become less political, but that we need to do politics in a way that allows people action possibilities, relationships, and material baselines. But yeah, interesting.
I think you.
There was one other person.
Yeah,
and then
one question.
Apart from the food co-ops, what are the changes that you've made in your life?
What have I made? Oh, that's a great question. I love that. I actually just wrote a piece on my Substack. Everyone should follow my Substack. No, about that. I think one of the ones that is less popular is I have given up on protests, on demonstrations. I don't go to demonstrations basically ever. I don't believe they have. Well, that's not quite right. I think demonstrations are important for recruiting people into movements. They are very good at that. And once those people get recruited into movements, their whole lives change. But I see them now as recruitment opportunities, and I don't see them as a vehicle for political change. There are vehicles for political change, but statistically it's not the demonstration, or even sadly the encampment, or whatever. I don't see them as effective, and I spend my energy elsewhere. So there's that. I think this is a very complicated long-term thing, but I'm also increasingly invested in the idea that living as a nuclear family is not very good for most people that are doing it. I'm not going to tell people they must live another way. I mean, that's kind of, its own problem, but I am extremely interested in offering people alternatives. And yeah, very, very interested in the question about, in particular, structures that ask us to live in ways that form long-form obligations with other people, because I'm extremely anti-individuation. So I live with both my partners, but I also now have other people who live in my house with me, and I've kind of built a communal life in addition to the food co-op that is about, the real difficulty and joy of relying on other people. I don't know if that's a good starting point, but yeah, I follow my Substack. I'm writing about this. It's a good question. I think I don't believe there is a boundary on the political. I think it's all political the whole way down until you look at what's in the veg drawer. So, yeah.
And I guess my question kind of actually nicely jumps from that.
Mm.
If we want to create a society that's less polarized, if we are trying to deal with extremism, who creates these third spaces where people can mingle?
We do. It's our job. And actually, I talk about this a bit in the book, because some people, like the bureaucrats that I grew up with in Washington, D.C., would be like, wonderful, we're going to have the government make a third space now. And actually, there's a particular sociologist, Robert Putnam, who is known for this. He just thinks about this problem all the time. He's like, oh no, we have a lack of, he likes to call it social capital, which is an amazing sort of like perfect economicization of this problem where humans have capital. It's wild. And Robert Putnam's theory of change is that you talk to American presidents directly in the room with them, and then hopefully they will change this problem. And that's what he has done. He talked to Bill Clinton and Obama, and they have these like meetings, and they give Robert Putnam medals for talking about the decline in social capital and how we're all bowling alone, and it's very concerning, and then nothing happens. And one of the things I write about in this book is that it's not surprising that nothing happens, because historically governments are enemies of social infrastructure. And they are enemies of social infrastructure because people who exist in social infrastructure often want to overthrow the government or at least challenge it, right? So, now, to be clear, if a government comes along and starts building us some nice social infrastructure, that's probably nice, although they are likely to surveil it and police it and like do other problematic things with it. But while I am not an anarchist in the sense that I am particularly not the kind of anarchist who thinks we are not going to have a state or that would be a great plan, I think we kind of need aspects of the state to, I don't know, deal with global warming or take out the trash. We can argue about the definition of anarchism later. I do think that social infrastructures need to be created outside of the state to a significant degree, or otherwise they're not really fulfilling the civic function. And they're also unlikely to happen or have significant effects. Yeah. And I would say like another strand of thinking that I'm not deeply enmeshed in but that gently collides with this is a lot of thinking about degrowth, right? So people who are thinking about how to exist in economies that don't need the constant capitalist cycle of growth think about, well, how else could we improve our lives? If we're not consuming more every year, what are we doing? And one of the main things that measurably improves people's well-being and happiness and makes them live longer and all these other things is just seeing other human beings more often. So for me, a lot of this question is about moving people back into a world where they sit uncomfortably but happily next to each other physically, you know? And I think that's work for us to do at every level of politics.
I have a question off of that. So,
okay,
because I'm really loving this whole thing about third spaces because I find it very resonant and stuff. What are suggestions on how we can create those? And I'm thinking because everything is so expensive these days.
Yeah.
So like if we want to create a third space, I'm wondering, do you have tips for how we can go about?
Well, I'm actually trying to convince someone to give me research funding right now so we can go do this. So can you ask me in 2 years? But I guess I want to go back to a really basic thing about it, which is related to what I said earlier, which is I think the worst way to do it is to go into a community that already exists, ignore all the existing third spaces, and then build your own thing that is also like kind of expensive and chic, you know?
Yeah.
And I really get that temptation. I went to a university where everyone wanted to be the president of a club, and so there were like 12,000 clubs, and they all had 2 members, and it was horrible. And I think we need to get over that. And instead, I would say go find the third space that already exists and figure out how to make it less expensive. Make sure there's time where people can bring their children because parents are super excluded from these places a lot of the time. Think about, you know, can we make it cheaper? Can we renovate it so it's nicer? Whatever, right? Sometimes you need to build it. Like sometimes there's just nothing in the community that's at all walkable or whatever, right? But my number one thing is like, don't make a new one. Go find one, right? Even if it's like making a playground next to the school that wasn't there before. I don't know, whatever that is. But I am also going to I'm going to try to convince the funder to get us some research, and then in 3 years when the next book comes out, it will have a bunch on this. Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, but I'll take any other questions, and then I'll go to dinner, and I can sign any books people want me to sign, and we can chat.
So,
yeah.
So you mentioned a Substack.
Yeah.
And there's the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, like why write a Substack?
Is it too expensive to have good ideas? Is it also that we're just constantly getting funneled rubbish, right?
Yeah, we are totally getting funneled rubbish.
Repetitive, or you might think that good thinking is expensive, or raising good thinkers is expensive, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, just any thoughts on that.
I mean, yes, we are constantly fed an algorithm. I have to work in the world of content to make a living, and yeah, we're getting funneled nonsense all the time. And one of the things that I actually talked about earlier in the last chapter where I did the last reading from is that I think another limitation on a lot of political theory, especially political theory, is the assumption that thought is easy. Like that it is like an effortless activity, roughly, right? So a lot of people think, oh, we'll just like all get together and have a chat, it would be so nice. But if you look at the research on what it takes for people to think about, I mean, the cognitive load, even of thinking about what to eat for breakfast, is hard for people. So the idea that they're gonna like rework their thinking about abortion or something over, you know, the morning coffee is wild. And then we live in a world that is making it harder and more cognitively exhausting all the time, and it's also feeding us at the same time a lot of like frictionless activity. Scrolling is the most common frictionless activity, right? So I guess I would see the problem of ease in that way. But yeah, it's also expensive. I mean, that's why it's a material problem for me. Thinking is a material problem. It is about our economy. We can't change it without changing our economy. Yeah.
Well, my question is, because I agree totally that most of debate and political discussion are mostly painful and useless in my experience.
Yeah.
But I guess, would that be the case that they are so because most of the ones in which we are involve automatically defending a sense of self.
Yes. Yeah, I talk
Yes.
about this in the book.
Whereas, for instance, I was thinking out of self-interest that maybe in the arts, studying films, you are forced to lose your sense of self. And so in some cases, that discursive activity may have a transformational effect.
Yeah, maybe. So the sense of self is a big thing. It actually comes out of my PhD research. But when you look at the, interestingly, it's not true that ever being exposed to ideas, it's not true that any kind of idea doesn't change our mind. People are actually pretty good at changing their mind about anything they don't see as political. And there's this like very clever experiment that I talk about early on in the book where they give people new information about stuff that doesn't feel political to them. Like who invented the light bulb, and it's actually some guy named Humphrey that I've never heard of, you know. And then people change their mind about that easily, right? The reason they don't change their mind about political stuff is because almost anything about a political idea challenges our sense of self. It either means that we were stupid, or we were bad, that we believed this thing in the past that might not be true now, or we're not that clever because we had the data wrong, or whatever. It's a challenge to the sense of self, and based on most of the psychological research, that kind of has an automatic like defense mechanism, right? In various ways. Can art help? Maybe. I mean, I don't research art, so I don't want to talk out of my ass. But I think I do talk in the book about different forms of political canvassing, and there is one that seems to engage the defenses less, and that's interesting. That it's more effective as a result, right? But yeah, I mean,
and that's based on storytelling.
Kind of. It's based on, I would say it's more based on the ability for human beings to have ambiguity. So the way that the questions are framed allows the person to kind of open back up to ambiguity, and then the practice is to be completely non-judgmental about the first set of beliefs as a listener, which I think is really hard, by the way. And then they are confronted with a person who's actually experienced the issue. And those three parts are all important. The ability to have ambiguity, which is not that easy for us cognitively. The idea that like it's fine whatever you believed in the past, so I'm not judging you for that, I'm just listening to you. And then the person will usually come in and say like, interestingly, this issue has affected me this way. Because although there are a small number of humans that are annoying enough to say like, I don't believe you that happened to you. Most people are like, oh, that must have happened to you because you're telling me to my face. Right, so that kind of canvassing seems to be quite effective. It's very long form, it's somewhat relationship building, and it's it kind of allows people to focus on the relationship with another person over their sense of self, and that doesn't surprise me.
Thanks.
That's interesting because I'm finding increasingly, so I've always loved the arts, but increasingly I'm turning back to art for a lot of things because I feel like there is this sort of combative, sort of defensive feeling you get with ideas.
Yeah.
Where anyway, it just made me think. And also, you actually have a quote in the book where you say, when your beliefs are entwined with your identity, changing your mind means changing your identity.
Yeah.
And that's a hard sell.
It's a big ask.
Yeah.
Or I talk about it as like surgery on the self. If I'm asking you to change your political beliefs, that's a huge ask.
Yeah.
You have to
On
like
the
open
spot.
yourself up and like remove your spleen or whatever.
So to wrap up, so I find it exciting knowing that actions and relationships can change things because I'm also exhausted of the sort of debate culture and stuff. Just wondering, as we all kind of, what day is it? Wednesday. As we kind of wrapping up our week and stuff, what are some suggestions you have of things we can kind of start doing right now? Like tips on
again,
what we
I just
can-
wrote a Substack on this, but
Yeah.
what I suggest people do is if they get very interested in this book, they'll write me and they'll say like, what do I do? And yeah, you know, there's kind of very concrete ideas about consumer co-ops, which is really what a food co-op is, or you know, join the union in your workplace, and I think those things are all important. I think, you know, not because they're perfect, those institutions are never perfect. Even the food co-op will eventually have some weird crisis over something, probably veganism, but but because it's important to have institutions that materially structure you so that you have to relate to other people and care about them, right? I also suggest that we join movements that ask more of us rather than less. Like I'm on 100 listservs and they have all collectively made me do nothing, you know? And I think it's better to join one movement that really asks you to do something every week, even though that's hard and weird and we're all tired. But actually it will give us a form of life we otherwise don't have. I think those are the main things. And then rebuild a third place that already exists in your community and make it actually accessible for people, even if they're parents or they're old or they're annoying or difficult,
Or don't have money.
or don't have money, which makes everyone feel annoying and difficult. So those are the things.
Well, one thing you can all do is get a copy of the book, and Sarah will be signing at the back. So thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone
Thank you for coming.
for coming.
Really appreciate
And,
it.
yeah.